Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. This is Joe, the bearded historian. He'll tell you an interesting story. Be careful of his soldiers, they can be brats. This is Angel, she's an entity. She'll cause chaos and plant her hands at you. This is Sue, she likes spirits, not the alcohol. She's the reason this channel exists. This is David, he likes fire trucks. He's here occasionally. Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. We preserve his story. Alright, it's Wayback Wednesday. And we're celebrating your birthday. And if you're at the time, you know whose birthday it is. So I'm not going to give it away. And because it's child related, sort of, or childhood related anyway, I've chosen clowns. If you don't like clowns, well, I'm sorry. I understand. Some people find them triggering, so if that is a phobia of yours, or if you find them scary or creepy, this is your warning. You will become a clown. You ready? Here we go. Shout out time. Here's a shout out just for you. You support me, so I support you. This shout out is for our friend. Alright, come on, there we go. Alright, she stole, supercalifragistic, Rich Cat, Kenny and Debbie, Richard, Ohio, catching, traveling, marketplace, visiting, Bobby, A&M, Leon, Spectral, Cheap, Jared, Wright, Carnival, Frugal, let's see, who else? Looks like there's Teza, Richard, let's see, there's some people from the back. We've got Susan, we got Abundance, Baked, Traveling, Anthony, Goat. Oh, it looks like it's going to be consumed. Alright, this is consumed, the goodness, and it's Kendra, which I will put on my notepad. Lifestyle and weight management coach. Channel combines healthy lifestyle with God's word. Goal is to help you consume goodness mentally, spiritually, physically, and emotionally, which is very cool. Kind of working on weight management, 3 of us anyway. We're not very good at it, but you know, we're working on it. And so if you're looking for insurance, any of that, check her out. Like, share, comment, have a good day. Alright, bearded historian, are you gonna tell something interesting?
I think so, because most of us grew up knowing this fella. Fella by the first name of Fred Rogers. More of you might remember him just simply as Mr. Rogers.
I didn't know he had a first name until today.
Yeah.
Which is stupid.
Something new, you know. But the fellow was born March 20th, 1928. So, you know, right before the Great Depression and all that fun stuff. He would go on to be, as we know, a television host, author, producer, and interestingly enough, a Presbyterian minister.
I did not know that one.
Me either. The program, which he started as the host, was Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, ran from 1968 through 2001. He was born in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, and he would live until the age of 74, passed away in Pittsburgh. Now, for his background, a couple interesting tidbits. He went to Dartmouth College, the Rollins College, and the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. Obviously, children's television presenter, actor, puppeteer, singer, composer, television producer, author, and educator, and again, a minister. He was active from 1951 until 2003. And he also won the Presidential Medal of Freedom, interestingly enough. Official name, Fred McFeely Rogers. Now, McFeely is a weird middle name, yeah.
Very interesting middle name.
To hit you in the field.
Yeah.
He began his career on at NBC in New York, returned to Pittsburgh in '53 to work on the children's programming at NET, later PBS, at television station WQED. He graduated from the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary with a bachelor's degree in divinity in '62 and became a minister in '63. He attended the University of Pittsburgh's Graduate School of Child Development, where he began his 30-year collaboration with child psychologist Margaret McFarland. He also helped develop the children's shows like the Children's Corner in '55 for WQED in Pittsburgh and Mr. Rogers in 1963 in Canada for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. And in '68 he returned to Pittsburgh and adopted the format of his Canadian series to create Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, running for 33 years, and was critically acclaimed for focusing on children's emotional and physical concerns on topics like death, sibling rivalry, school enrollment, and divorce. He passed away again at age 74 of stomach cancer. His work in children's television has been widely lauded, and he received more than 40 honorary degrees in several awards, including a Lifetime Achievement Emmy in 1997, again, Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2002. He was inducted into the Television Hall of Fame. How was he not?
Yeah, definitely. How would you not?
Yeah. That was in '99. Rogers influenced many writers and producers of children's television shows, and his broadcast provided comfort during tragic events and even after his death. Now again, born in 1928 at 705 Main Street in Latrobe, his father, James Hillis Rogers, was a very successful businessman who was president of the McFeely Brick Company. Well, there was where his middle name came from.
That's a stupid way to come up with a
middle name. Yeah. One of Latrobe's most prominent businesses, his mother, Nancy Nee McFeely, apparently her last name, knitted sweaters for American soldiers from western Pennsylvania who were fighting in Europe and regularly volunteered at the Latrobe Hospital. Initially dreaming of becoming a doctor, she settled for a life of hospital volunteer work. Her father, Fred Brooks McFeely, after whom Rogers was named, was an entrepreneur. Now, Rogers grew up in a large 3-story brick house at 737 Weldon Street. He had a sister, Elaine, who the Rogerses adopted when he was 11 years old. Rogers spent much of his childhood alone, playing with puppets, and also spent time with his grandfather. He began playing the piano when he was 5. Through an ancestor who immigrated from Germany to the U.S., Johannes Meffert, Rogers is the 6th cousin of actor Tom Hanks, who portrayed him in the film A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. Yeah.
And I remember that movie, and I never watched it.
Yeah, me either.
Mostly because I was never really big into Mr. Rogers.
Yeah. Interesting, Rogers had a difficult childhood, shy, introverted, and overweight. He frequently homebound after suffering bouts of asthma. He was bullied as a child in his weight and was called Fat Freddy. According to Morgan Neville, director of the 2008 documentary Won't You Be My Neighbor, Rogers had a lonely childhood. I think he made friends with himself as much as he could. He had a ventriloquist dummy, he had stuffed animals, and he would create his own worlds in his childhood bedroom. Well, he had attended the Latrobe High School, where he overcame his shyness, and it was tough for him at the beginning, Rogers told NPR's Terry Gross in 1984. And then I made a couple friends who found out the core of me was okay, and one of them was the head of the football team. Rogers became president of the Student Council, a member of the National Honor Society, and the editor-in-chief of the school yearbook. He registered for the draft in Greensburg, Pennsylvania in 1948 at age 20, where he was classified 1A, available for military service. However, his status was changed to unqualified following the Armed Forces physical on October the 12th, 1950.
Flat feet?
Flat feet, probably. He attended Dartmouth College for 1 year before transferring to Rollins College, where he graduated magna cum laude in 1951 with a Bachelor of Music. He then attended the Theological Seminary, graduated again magna cum laude in 1962. ordained as a minister by the Pittsburgh Presbytery of the United Presbyterian Church in 1963. His work as an ordained minister rather than a pastor at a church was to minister to children and their families through television. He regularly appeared before church officials to maintain his ordination. Now, early work, he wanted to go to the seminary after college, but instead chose to go to the nascent medium of television after experiencing TV at his parents' home in 1951 during his senior year at Rollins College. In a CNN interview, he said, "I went into television because I hated it so, and I thought that there was some way to use this fabulous instrument to nurture those who would watch and listen." After graduating in 1951, he worked at NBC at New York City as a floor director of Your Hit Parade, The Kate Smith Hour, and Gabby Hayes' Children's Show, and as an assistant producer of The Voice of Firestone. Now, in 1953, Rogers returned to Pittsburgh to work as a program director in public television at the WQED. Josie Carey worked with him to develop a children's show, The Children's Corner, which Carey hosted. Rogers worked off-camera to develop puppets, characters, and music for the show. He used many puppet characters developed during this time, some as Daniel the Striped Tiger, named after WQED's station manager Dorothy Daniel, who gave Rogers a tiger puppet before the show's premiere. King Friday the 13th, Queen Sarah Saturday, named after Rogers' wife, X the Owl, Henrietta, and Lady Elaine in his later work. Children's television entertainer Ernie Combs was an assistant puppeteer. The Children's Corner would win a Sylvania Award for the best locally produced children's programming in 1955 and was broadcast nationally on NBC. While working at the show, Rogers attended the Pittsburgh Theology Seminary and was ordained as a minister, 1963. Attended the University of Pittsburgh's Graduate School of Child Development, where he began working with child psychiatrist Margaret McFarland, who, according to Rogers' biography from Maxwell King, became his key advisor and collaborator and child education guru. Much of Rogers' thinking about and appreciation for children was shaped and informed by McFarland. She was his consultant for most of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood scripts and songs for 30 years. Well, in 1963, as we mentioned, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation in Toronto contacted him to come and write children's programs, Mr. Rogers. It lasted from 1963 to 1967. It was the first time Rogers appeared on camera. CBC's children's programming heard Fred Rainsbury insist on it, telling Rogers, "Fred, I've seen you talk with kids. Let's put yourself on the air." Combs joined Rogers in Toronto as an assistant puppeteer. Rogers also worked with Combs in the children's show Butternut Square from 1964 to 1967. Rogers acquired the rights to Mr. Rogers in 1967 and returned to Pittsburgh with his wife, 2 young sons, and the sets he developed despite a potentially promising career with the CBC. And actually, there was no prospects in Pittsburgh for him. On Rogers' recommendation, Combs remained in Toronto and became Rogers' Canadian equivalent of the iconic television personality, creating the children's program Mr. Dress Up, which ran from 1967
Mr. Dress Up?
Yeah. Ran from 1967 to 1996.
Interesting.
Yeah. Rogers' work for the CBC helped shape and develop the concept and style for his later program in the public broadcasting service in the U.S. Now, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, also called The Neighborhood, a half-hour educational children's program starring Rogers, began airing nationally in 1968, ran for 895 episodes.
Wow.
It was videotaped at QWED in Pittsburgh and broadcast by the National Education Television, which later became the Public Broadcasting Service, or PBS. Its first season had 180 black and white episodes. Each subsequent season, they were filmed in color and funded by PBS, the Sears Roebuck Foundation, and other charities, consisting of 65 episodes. By the time it ended production in December of 2000, the average rating was about 0.7% of television households, or 680,000 homes, and it was aired on 384 PBS stations. At its peak in 85-86, its ratings were 2.1%, or 1.8 million homes. Now, the last episode aired on 2001, but PBS continued to air reruns, and by 2016, it was the third longest running program in PBS history.
Interesting.
Many of the sets and props of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, like the trolley, the sneakers, and the castle, were created for Rogers' show in Toronto by CBC designers and producers. The program also incorporated most of the highly imaginative elements which later became famous, such as the slow pace and the host's quiet manner. The format of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood remained virtually unchanged for the entire run of the program. Every episode would begin with the camera's eye view of the model of the neighborhood, then panning in closer to the representation of the house where the piano instrumental of the theme song, Won't You Be My Neighbor, is performed by music director Johnny Costa, and inspired by the Beethoven Sonata, is played. The camera zooms into a model representing Mr. Rogers' house, then cuts to the house interior and pans across the room to the front door, which Rogers opens up as he sings the theme song to greet his visitors while changing his suit jacket to a cardigan knitted by his mother, and his dress shoes to sneakers, complete with a shoe tossed from one hand to the other. The episode's theme is introduced, and Mr. Rogers leaves his home to visit another location. Camera panning back to the neighborhood model and zooming in to the new location that he enters. Once the segment ends, Mr. Rogers leaves and returns to his home, indicating that it's time to visit the neighborhood of make-believe. Mr. Rogers proceeds to the window seat by the trolley track and sets up the action there as the trolley comes out. The camera follows it down the tunnel in the back wall of the house as it enters the neighborhood of make-believe. The stories and lessons take place over a week's worth of episodes and involve puppets and human characters. The end of the visit occurs when the trolley returns to the same tunnel from which it emerged, reappearing in Mr. Rogers' home. He then talks to the viewers before concluding the episode. He often feeds the fish, cleans up any props he had used, and returns to the front room where he sings the closing song while changing back to his dress shoes and jacket. He exits the front door at the end of the song, and the camera zooms out of the home and pans across the neighborhood model as the episode ends. Now, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood emphasized young children's social and emotional needs, and unlike another PBS show, Sesame Street, which premiered in 1969, did not focus on cognitive learning. Writer Kathy Burlock Jackson said, while both shows target the same preschool audience and prepare children for kindergarten, Sesame Street concentrates on school readiness skills, while Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood focuses on child's developing psyche and feelings and sense of moral and ethical reasoning. The neighborhood also spent fewer resources on research than Sesame Street, but Rogers used early childhood education concepts taught by his mentor, Margaret McFarland, Benjamin Spock, Eric Erickson, and T. Barry Brazelton in his lessons. As the Washington Post noted, Rogers taught young children about civility, tolerance, sharing, and so forth in a reassuring tone and leisurely cadence. He tackled difficult topics like the death of a family pet, sibling rivalry, the addition of a newborn into the family, moving and enrolling in a new school, and divorce. For example, he wrote a special segment that dealt with the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy that aired June 7, 1968, 2 days after the assassination occurred. According to King, the process of putting each episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood together was painstaking, and Rogers' contribution to all the episodes, played the piano, and sang for most of the characters, both puppet and human, played most significant roles. He also produced and approved every detail of the program. The puppets created for the neighborhood of make-believe included the extraordinary variety of personalities. They were simple puppets, but complex, complicated, and utterly honest beings. In 1971, Rogers formed the Family Communications, Inc., FCI, now the Fred Rogers Company, to produce the neighborhood, other programs, and non-broadcast materials.
Huh.
In 1975, he stopped producing Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood to focus on adult programming. Reruns of The Neighborhood continued to air on PBS. King reports the decision caught many of the co-workers and supporters off guard. Rogers continued to confer with McFarland about child development in early childhood education, however. And in 1979, after an almost 5-year hiatus, he returned to producing The Neighborhood. King calls the new version stronger and more sophisticated than ever. King writes that by the program's second run in the 1980s, it was such a cultural touchstone that it inspired numerous parodies, most notably Eddie Murphy's parody in Saturday Night Live in the early 1980s. Now, Rogers retired from producing The Neighborhood in 2001 at the age of 73, although, again, reruns would continue to air. He and the FCI had been making about 2 or 3 weeks of new programs per year for many years, filling the rest of his time slots from a library of about 300 shows made since 1979.
Wow.
And the final original Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood aired on August 31st, 2001. Now, in 1969, Rogers testified before the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Communications, which was chaired by Democratic Senator John Pastor of Rhode Island. U.S. President Lyndon Johnson had proposed a $20 million bill for the creation of PBS before he left office, but his successor, Richard Nixon, wanted to cut the funding to $10 million. Even though Rogers was not yet nationally known, he was chosen to testify because of his ability to make persuasive arguments and to connect emotionally with his audience. The clip of Rogers' testimony, which was televised and has since been viewed by millions of people on the internet, helped secure funding for PBS for many years afterwards. According to King, Rogers' testimony was considered one of the most powerful pieces of testimony ever offered before Congress and one of the most powerful pieces of video presentation ever filmed. It brought Pastor to tears, and according to King, it has been studied by public relations experts and academics. Congressional funding for PBS increased from $9 million to $22 million, and in 1970, Nixon appointed Rogers as the chair of the White House Conference on Children and Youth. In 1978, while on hiatus, Rogers wrote, produced, and hosted a 30-minute interview program for adults on PBS called Old Friends, New Friends. It lasted 20 episodes. Rogers' guests include Hoagie Carmichael, Helen Hayes, Milton Berle, Lauren Hollander, poet Robert Frost's daughter Leslie, and Willie Stargell. I'd like to check that out. In September of 1987, Rogers actually visited Moscow to appear as the first guest on the long-running Soviet children's TV show, Good Night, Little Ones, with host Titania Vidalenta. The appearance was broadcast in the Soviet Union on December 7th, coinciding with the Washington Summit meeting between Mikhail Gorbachev and the U.S. President Ronald Reagan in D.C. Vidalenta visited the set of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood in November. Her visit was taped, later aired in March of 1988 as part of Rogers' program. In 1994, Rogers wrote, produced, and hosted a special for PBS called Fred Rogers' Heroes, in which featured interviews and portraits of 4 people from across the country who were a positive impact for children and education. The first time Rogers appeared on television as an actor and not himself was in a 1996 episode of Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman, playing a preacher.
I think I might have watched that episode.
Rogers would give scores of interviews. Though reluctant to appear on television talk shows, he would usually charm the host with his quick wit and ability to ad-lib on a moment's notice. Rogers was one of the country's most sought-after commencement speakers, making over 150 speeches. His friend and colleague David Newell reported that Rogers would agonize over a speech, and King reported that Rogers was at least guarded during his speeches, which was about children, television, education, his view of the world, how to make the world a better place, and the quest for self-knowledge. His tone would be quiet and informal, but commanded attention. Many speeches, including the ones he made in accepting a Lifetime Achievement Emmy in 1997, for his introduction to the Television Hall of Fame in 1999, and his final commencement speech at Dartmouth in 2002, he instructed his audience to remain silent and think for a moment about someone who had a good influence on them. Now, Rogers met his wife, Sarah Joanne Bird, called Joni, from Jacksonville, Florida, while they were attending Rollins College. They were married from 1952 until she died in 2003. They had 2 sons, James and John. Joni Rogers was an accomplished pianist who, like Fred, earned a Bachelor of Music from Rollins and went on to earn a Master of Music from Florida State University. She had performed publicly with her college classmate, Janine Morrison, from 1976 to 2008. According to a biographer, Maxwell King, Rogers' close associates said that he was absolutely faithful to his marriage vows. Rogers was a red-green colorblind. He became a pescatarian in 1970 after the death of his father, and a vegetarian in the early 80s, saying he couldn't eat anything that had a mother. He became a co-owner of Vegetarian Times in the mid-1980s and said in one issue, "I love tofu burgers and beets." He told Vegetarian Times that he became a vegetarian for both ethical and health reasons. According to his biographer Maxwell King, Rogers also signed his name to a statement protesting wearing animal furs. Rogers was a registered Republican, but according to Joni Rogers, he was very independent in the way he voted, choosing not to talk about politics because he wanted to be impartial. Rogers was a Presbyterian, and many of his messages he expressed in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood were inspired by the core tenets of Christianity. Rogers rarely spoke about his faith on the air. He believed that teaching through example was as powerful as about preaching. He said, "You don't need to speak overtly about religion in order to get the message across." According to the writer Shay Tuttle, Rogers considered his faith a fundamental part of his personality and called the space between the viewer and the television set holy ground. He also studied Catholic mysticism, Judaism, Buddhism, and other faiths and cultures. King called him the unique television star with a real spiritual life, emphasizing the values of patience, reflection, and silence in a noisy world. King reported that despite Rogers' family wealth, he cared very little about making money and lived frugally, especially as he and his wife grew older. King reported that Rogers' relationship with his young audience was important to him. For example, since hosting Mr. Rogers in Canada, he answered every letter sent to him by hand. After Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood began airing in the U.S., the letters increased in volume, and he hired a staff member and producer, Hedda Chaperon, to answer them, but he read, edited, and signed each one. King wrote that Rogers responded to his viewers' letters as a pastoral duty of sorts. The New York Times called Rogers a dedicated lap swimmer, and Tom Junod, author of Can You Say Hero, and the 1998 Esquire profile of Rogers, said, "Nearly every morning of his life, Mr. Rogers had gone swimming." Rogers began swimming when he was a child at the family's vacation home outside Latrobe, where they owned a pool, and during their winter trips to Florida. King wrote that swimming and playing the piano were lifelong passions, and that both gave him a chance to feel capable and in charge of his destiny, and that swimming became an important part of that strong sense of self-discipline he cultivated. Rogers swam daily at the Pittsburgh Athletic Association after waking every morning between 4:30 and 5:30 a.m.
Oh, wow. I know how you feel, dude.
Yeah, to pray and read the Bible and prepare himself for the day. Didn't smoke or drink. According to Junod, he did nothing to change his weight from the 143 pounds he weighed for most of his adult life in 1998. This also included napping daily, going to bed at 9:30 p.m.
I wish I could.
Yeah, and sleeping 8 hours a night without interruption.
I wish I could.
That will never happen to me. Even on strong drugs, that would not happen to me. Junod said Rogers saw his weight as a destiny fulfilled, telling Junod, "The number 143 means I love you. It takes 1 letter to say I, 4 letters to say love, and 3 letters to say you." Now, after his retirement in 2001, he remained busy working with FCI, studying religion and spirituality, making public appearances, traveling, and working on the Children's Media Center, named after him, at St. Vincent College in Latrobe, with Arch-Abbot Douglas Nowicki, a chancellor of the college. By the summer of 2002, he had a chronic stomach pain that became severe enough for him to see a doctor about it. In October of 2002, he was diagnosed with stomach cancer. He delayed treatment until he served as Grand Marshal of the 2003 Rose Parade with Art Linkletter and Bill Cosby in January. On January 6th, Rogers underwent stomach surgery. Sadly, would die less than 2 months later, on February 27th, 2003, at his home with his wife of 50 years at his side.
That's kind of cool.
Yeah. While comatose shortly before his death, he received the last rites of the Catholic Church from the Archabbot Nowicki. Now, the following day, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette covered Rogers' death on the front page and dedicated an entire section to his death and impact. The newspaper also reported that by noon the internet was already full of appreciative posts by parents, viewers, producers, and writers. Rogers' death was widely lamented. Most of the U.S. metropolitan newspapers ran his obituary on their front page. Some dedicated entire sections of coverage for his death. WQED aired programs about Rogers in the evening he died. The Post-Gazette reported that the ratings for their coverage were 3 times higher than their normal ratings. That same evening, Nightline, an ABC broadcast, a rerun of the recent interview with Rogers. The program got the highest ratings of the day, beating the February average ratings of The Late Show with David Letterman and The Tonight Show with Jay Leno. On March 4th, the U.S. House of Representatives unanimously passed a resolution honoring Rogers, sponsored by Representative Mike Doyle from Pennsylvania. On March 1st, 2003, a private funeral was held for Rogers at Unity Chapel, which was restored by Rogers' father at Unity Cemetery in Latrobe. About 80 relatives, co-workers, and close friends attended the service, which was planned in a great secrecy so that their closest to him could grieve in private. Reverend John McCall, pastor of the Rogers Family Church, 6th Presbyterian Church in Squirrel Hill, gave the homily. Reverend William Barker, a retired Presbyterian minister, was also a close friend of Mr. Rogers, and the voice of Mr. Platypus on the show read Rogers' favorite Bible passages. Rogers was interred at the University Cemetery at the hometown of Latrobe, in a mausoleum owned by his mother's family. And on March 3rd, 2003, a public memorial was held at Pines Hall in Pittsburgh. According to the Post-Gazette, 2,700 people attended.
Wow.
Violinist Isaac Perlman, cellist Yo-Yo Ma via video, and organist Alan Morrison performed in honor of Rogers. Barker officiated the service, and in attendance were Pittsburgh philanthropist Elsie Hillman, former Good Morning America host David Hartman, the Very Hungry Caterpillar author Eric Carley, and Arthur creator Mac Brown. Businesswoman and philanthropist Teresa Hines, PBS President Pat Mitchell, and Executive Director of the Pittsburgh Project Salim Gumrell gave remarks. Jeff Erlinger, who at age 10 appeared on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood in 1981 to explain his electric wheelchair, also spoke. The memorial was broadcast several times on Pittsburgh television stations and websites throughout the day. But this was his date of his birth, and I have to say the world's a better place for the fellow that we knew with his trademark sweaters and shoes.
I don't think I ever watched an episode of his show.
I watched a few. I was big into Sesame Street, but every once in a while I would catch a couple episodes.
I may have, but I honestly don't remember.
Yeah. I do remember also that there was a kind of cool episode one time where the mailman came by and his feet were hurting. And Mr. Rogers actually invited him in to put his feet into the pool and help his feet. And I guess it was quite a landmark episode for television networks at the time. But folks, this has been the Bearded Historian. You folks have a good day, and we will see you next week. Goodbye.
Ugh.